I want to just give a little bit of, I'm supposed to start with a joke. I heard that in seminary. And I am so lousy at jokes, but I did hear one. Has nothing to do with my sermon, but here it is. Okay, so did you hear the joke about the bed? Didn't hear the joke about the bed? Well, they haven't made it up yet. I got it right. That was cool. Okay, good. Thank you for laughing at that. You are very generous people. Okay, Galatians, I want to give you a little bit of background before I dive into the meat of what Paul shared with us there. The first, second, and third chapters of Galatians, if you want to read it this afternoon or sometime this week in your studies, Paul is ticked. He is angry. This is a church that he started. He went and witnessed to these folks and shared with them the gospel, and they responded to the message of Jesus Christ and were saved 18 months before now. He takes off on his first missionary trek, comes back, and he finds things just kind of a mess. These are people who had chosen to live by the Spirit. They gave their lives to Jesus. They were indwelled with the Spirit. They were living just magnificent. He was thrilled with them. They were thrilled with him. But then something happened. And what happened was there were other teachers that came in while he was gone and said, "You think that you're saved just because you believe? You're wrong." And when Paul heard about this, he just railed on them for the first several chapters. And he said, they said, "You are not saved by faith alone. You have to go to the festivals. You have to do the sacrifices to God in order to try to please him. You got to go to church. You got to go to the temple and worship. You've got to do these things to be a good Jew, to be saved, to be a part of heaven. You got to do all that the law requires." And Paul comes back after seeing a church kind of get transformed from inside hearing this new message, who decided, oh man, you know what, we got to be circumcised now. We got to do all the festivals, the moon festival, the harvest festival. We got to do these festivals in order to please God. God's not going to be happy with us. And Paul says, no, you heard the message. You've forgotten what I told you. I showed you, I taught you that Jesus Christ came, died for you, rose again, and if you believe, you are saved. Bottom line, you're not saved by the law. This isn't civil law. When he talks about law in here, he's not talking about civil law. He's talking about the church law, the Jewish law, in order to please God. And he says, people that live by the Spirit are not under that law. You're living by the Spirit. So that's kind of the context of what Paul has done. I haven't disappeared. I'm not running away. Kind of a tough thing to come back to, and Paul was really stewed about that. He didn't like what was happening, but by the time we get to like the fourth chapter, Paul is ready to start talking about the gospel again, and you can almost hear his tone. His tone changes. He literally takes on the gospel message and decides to share with them that message again, all over again. So he does that. I remember well, when I was young, one of the very first jobs I had, this isn't working out very well. It's still a good illustration, I think. I worked at Judson Hills, and I was a camp counselor. It was our Baptist campground, and just a great place. And there was a stream, there's a creek in the middle. You guys might know the camp. It's where the Mohican School used to go. If you remember, my kids were in like the third grade when they went down there. That's our campground. Well, they have a creek, runs right through the campground. It's really cool. When I was a counselor, we came up with this genius idea of having tug-of-wars. So we would get this giant long rope, and we'd put half of it on one side of the stream, half of it on the other side of the stream. We would take something and tie a little thing in the middle. And then we'd put the kids on both sides. And it would begin. I was thinking about doing this with Don, but since he's under the weather, he'd probably still beat me. But I remember well the tug-of-wars at Judson Hills, and half of the group would end up in the creek. I kind of feel like Paul's trying to educate the Christians in Galatia, that there's a tug-of-war that goes on all the time in your life. And he uses the terminology that it's between the flesh and the spirit. And so I want to share with you a Billy Graham quote. Billy Graham wrote these things. He says, "Two conflicting forces cannot exist in the human heart. When doubt reigns, faith cannot abide. Where hatred rules, love is crowded out. Where selfishness rules, there love cannot dwell. When worry is present, trust cannot crowd itself in, its way in." Those are Billy Graham's words trying to describe what Paul was describing and what he hears from Paul. And that is that we are human beings. We have this side of us that is the flesh. It's the part of us that Jesus sort of connected with when he came and lived among us. But he's spirit. We are flesh. He offers to us the Spirit of God. And so, church, if you are sitting here and you have given your life to Jesus, if you believe in God, if you know Jesus died for you and rose again, you have the Spirit coming to you. Now, you usually pray to Jesus, but if something happens in your life where you demonstrate Christian love, or if you demonstrate Christian goodness or kindness or any of those fruits of the Spirit, that's the Holy Spirit working through you. Okay? That's the Spirit of God working through you. You have the Spirit of God with you, and God says that he will always have the Spirit with us. He will not leave us abandoned. When Jesus went, that was one of the last things he said. He'll give us the Spirit, and it's always there. But Paul says, even so, it doesn't mean you are sinless. It doesn't mean that when the Spirit comes on you, you don't ever have to worry about sin again. You can't sin. You're a Christian. You're a believer. You can't ever sin again. Untrue, because we are still people in the flesh. That won't happen until we go and live with him for all of eternity. But now, we have this tug-of-war that's going on almost all the time. I do feel in the analogy that the tug-of-war grows less and less when you're older as a Christian. Not in age, but in the years of your faith. The longer you serve as a Christian, the less this tug, impacts you. But it does impact you. You are human beings. You have temptations. Paul names this stuff, and he says, whoa, be careful. Don't get caught up in fornication. That's sex outside of marriage. Marriage is the guideline, Paul says. Don't get caught up in impurity, in licentiousness. That's lacking morality. That's lacking morals. Being willing to be devious to get your way. That's licentiousness. Idolatry, sorcery. Sorcery in our day and age, it's basically drug use. Don't get caught up in drug use. It's like sorcery. Sorcery is something that takes over you and you do things that you normally wouldn't have the power to do. It's sorcery. It's like drug use. Don't get caught up in that. Enmity, that's a hatred and an anger towards somebody else that you just can't get rid of, and it just eats away at you. You have an enmity toward someone that's done something to you, and you just can't let it go. He says that's not good. Strife, jealousy. I get jealous sometimes. As an older Christian, I don't get jealous nearly like I used to. You sort of learn that it just doesn't matter. God gives you what he's going to give you, and that's good enough. You don't have to be jealous. Anger, quarrels, dissensions. Some people love just to cause trouble between groups. We've seen it in the churches for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I know I'm a Baptist. Factions, envy. Factions are sinful. Did you hear that? Factions are sinful. Church, be careful to be a part of factions. Well, you heard about those Christians. Don't even think of that. It's dissension, it's faction. Be careful, Paul says. Envy, drunkenness, carousing. You guys know all about that. And then listen to what he says. And things like these. So the list could go on. You know the list. You know some of the things that maybe aren't even on here. There are things that tempt you, that cause you to draw away from God. And sometimes you literally turn and you walk towards those things. And he says, I'm warning you, be careful, like I warned you before, 18 months ago. Be careful. Instead, live a different way. You remember Alice Cooper? Oh, all you older people chuckled. Aha! I was going to do a picture of Alice Cooper, and I decided, he is such a... I couldn't put a picture up there. He used to wear black eye and just evil looking. And when I was a kid, he would do concerts, and I'm sorry, kids, not to gross anybody out. He became famous for biting bats' heads off of a bat and doing evil things like drinking blood. An evil guy. He literally turned away from everything he knew. Now, did you hear what I just said? He turned away from everything he knew. He had been raised in a preacher's home. His dad was a preacher. His grandfather was an evangelist. He decided to go into entertainment and become a rock star. But then about 40 years ago, he woke up. And I love this wake up. I love the fact that he came to his senses and he turned to God and he gave his life to Jesus. Alice Cooper, yes, gave his life to Jesus, decided that he had to stop drinking, he had to stop carousing, he had to stop doing drugs. He said in the Daily News, he was interviewed, he said, everything that could go wrong was shutting down inside of me. My body was shutting down. He looked emaciated. He was thrown up. He just was in a world of physical hurt. He said, I was drinking with Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, and I kept trying to keep up with Keith Moon, and they all died at 27. And Paul says this stuff leads to death. So Alice Cooper said, I don't want to go down that road. My guess is he called his dad. Maybe not, I don't know. But he gave his life to Christ. And he ended up, from that day forward, he ended up going to church. He hasn't missed a Sunday since. He does Bible study. He does personal devotions and prayer every day. Yes, Alice Cooper. And he goes to his pastor. You young folks are looking at me like you don't have a clue who I'm talking about. I'm glad you don't. Unfortunately, it was part of my high school time. Alice Cooper goes to his pastor 40 years ago, and he says, I can't keep doing this. I think I need to change my name. The image of what I am is repulsive now to me. I can't keep up with these crowds and what's happening. His pastor said, don't do that. Don't change your name. You are Alice Cooper, now Christian. You have an unbelievable testimony. Make sure you hang on to your name and share the testimony. And so he does that. He still does that. He's 70 years old. He's still alive, doing things, performing. He prays on a regular basis. He went to Marilyn Manson. You remember Marilyn Manson, the Satanist? And gave him a Bible and witnessed to him and tried to win him over to Jesus, to help him wake up. I don't think it worked. I never heard that it did. The story of Alice Cooper is a story that Paul would resonate with and say, that's it. The tug of war inside, it's still going on, but he chose not to do those things anymore. So here's one of my thoughts. The things of the flesh are things that we choose to jump into. And they're named by Paul as items. It's not a big whole conglomerate. You don't have the sins of the flesh when you do all those things. You do one of those things. You have the sins of the flesh. But the fruit of the Spirit sounds very, very different. The fruit of the Spirit is like, it's described as like a bouquet. I think it's a good description is like a bouquet. You have fruit. I loved the children's story. I should have just let her keep going. She had a good sermon running there. So here's the fruit of the Spirit. By contrast, he says, now by contrast to the things of the flesh, the fruit of the Spirit, verse 22, is, you know them, you probably could rattle them off, you ought to memorize them. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things, you don't need the law anymore. He says, against such things there is no law. There is no Jewish law that you need if you allow the Spirit to guide you, Paul says. And so I guess I want to hear that. I need to hear that in my own life. I need to be reminded of that there's nothing I can do to win God's pleasure. It's something He did for me. And if I accept it, He's going to give me a bouquet of sweet-smelling aroma flowers called fruit of the Spirit. And I hope you guys see some of that. If you've ever seen me be loving, it's not me, it's the Spirit. If you've ever seen me be joyful, it's not me, it's the Spirit. And all of those things, and likewise, if you've ever seen a person do these things, it's not them, it's the Spirit working through them to show you who God is and who Jesus is and who the Spirit is. So I gave you the Greek word that Paul literally uses when he says, and the fruit of the Spirit is agape. Well, agape is love. But it's not the kind of love that when you see that beautiful girl or that really handsome guy and you go, it's not that kind of love. That's a different kind of love. Or your good buddies or your good girlfriends that you like to go shopping with and stuff, and you just love them. Or when you drive past Taco Bell and you go, oh, I love tacos. It's not that kind of love. This love is a sacrificial love. It's Jesus' love. It's the love that Jesus wants us to do with one another. We try to demonstrate it in our marriages. Marriages are supposed to be sacrificial, not just erotic. They're not just supposed to be because they are there. We're supposed to be sacrificial with each other. Kara, joy, fruit of the Spirit. This isn't because you won the lottery. You guys bought those tickets and one of you won and you became a millionaire and you go, oh, I have joy. No, you have happiness. Well, it's a beautiful day now. The rain's not coming down. Yes, I know. I'm so filled with joy. No, it's not that kind of joy. That's happiness. This joy is a joy that no matter what your situation is, no matter how hard the situation is, you have something inside you that you know there is a source of joy. Paul had it and he was in prison. That's joy. Irene, peace. He has a peace. It's kind of connected to that joy. You have a peaceful understanding in the midst of absolute chaos. Some of you are going through that chaos right now. Your life is struggle. I talked to a guy yesterday. He said he had to get down on his knees. His crops weren't coming up. He got off of his tractor. Some of you farmers could get this. You know what he was going through. He said, I finally just had to give up. He literally got off of his tractor, got in his field on his hands and knees and wept. He needed the peace. Because even though the rain keeps coming or the rain stops, God offers peace. So the fruit of the Spirit is this amazing bouquet. It keeps you from having the tug of war happen so, I don't know, aggressively or whatever. But Jesus gives it to us. He gives us that spirit to live by. A better translation is not life in the Spirit, but walking in the Spirit. Paul calls us to walk in the Spirit. He doesn't, now listen to that. He doesn't say run. It's not a race through life. He wants us to take the Spirit of God and walk with it. Each day, it's a walk. Each day, it's a reminder that there's a tug going on. And if you allow the Spirit to reign in your life, the tug is less. And so choose the Spirit of God, and He'll get you through it. It's an awesome, awesome thing that you have available to you through the fruit of the Spirit. Okay, we all have heroes. I'm going to end with this. We all have heroes. My dad is one of my heroes. He's been gone now with Jesus for a number of years, but he is still one of my amazing heroes. And my mom. Pastor James is becoming one of my heroes. I love the man. I hope you do too. One of my heroes was demonstrated to me in a movie. He was born in 1902. His name was Eric Liddell. And Eric Liddell was a Scotsman who had been born to missionaries to China, in China. He was born in China. And he was an amazing athlete. He played rugby in college. He was a track star. He was the, whatever their grade A track races are in Scotland and in China, in the universities. He was known worldwide. And his race was the 100-meter race. And he was just destroying everybody. And he was excellent at it. He was also an amazing believer. He had amazing faith in God. And he tied all of that together. He heard Paul's messages about racing in the scriptures and took them seriously and ran the race to win every time he was out there on the track. Well, he ended up at the age of 20, in 1924, at the age of whatever, 19 or whatever it is, jumping into the Olympics. And he was hands down going to win the 100-meter race. You know this story if you watch the movie Chariots of Fire. Man, I'm really showing my age today with my illustrations. Alice Cooper, Chariots of Fire, you kids don't have a clue what I'm talking about. I'm talking Greek. Chariots of Fire is the movie about Eric Liddell. And when he got to the Olympics, his convictions just kicked in. And the race that he was going to take and become the world champion in, the heat was taken off on Sunday morning. Sunday morning. He has a conviction that he can't do that. So he goes and he talks to the judges. They will not change anything. They won't do anything about it. He prays. He connects with his sister, gets some advice, finally decides he cannot run in that race. I just can't do the Olympics on a Sunday. I have to be in church. I have to honor what I feel God wants me to do. So he does that. He says his next two best races are the 200-meter and the 400-meter. Not very good at either one of them. Lots of people with better records, but they weren't running on Sunday, so he jumped in. He ends up winning the bronze in the 200-meter race, World Olympics, and then he goes and runs the 400-meter race, which he is not very good at, and he sets a world record and wins the 1924 Olympics 400-meter race. I read a bunch of his testimony and a bunch of his story. I encourage you to do that. Just the bottom line is this. He leaves the Olympics, requests all over the place to come and speak. He does not go. He goes back to China and becomes a missionary. The Spirit of God is here in this place. Where two or three are gathered, there he is in the midst of them. My prayer is as you look around, you see it. the fruit, the evidence, and then claim it for yourself. And if you have this going on, there's a way out of the struggle. There's a way out of that. Let the Spirit take over for you. Amen? Amen.